Alright, here we go. This is the Elegoo Smart Robot Car. And I'm going to show you how to build one. But before I do, I'm going to show you how it works when they are finally completed. So this is basically what you're going to end up with. A nice little car. You've got line following capability. You've got distance sensing capability. And you also have this device right here is an infrared. Excuse me. Where'd my remote control go? So you have a remote control, so you can remote control it with this. You also get, where did it go? You also get this Bluetooth device, which you plug in here, and then you can control it from your phone. So it's a pretty handy dandy little robot with lots of different ways of operating it. You have to load a new program to get it to work in each one of those modes, and you do that through a USB port to the Arduino here from your laptop. And so what I'm going to do now is just turn it on. Right now the program for distance sensing is loaded, and what happens is the car will take off driving straight until it gets close to something like my hand here, and then this ultrasonic distance sensor will determine that it is too close. It will stop. The servo motor here will turn the distance sensor and look to the right, then it will look to the left to see which way is a clear way to go. Then the car will back up, it'll turn in that direction, and then take off again and repeat that. So I'm going to turn it on by turning on this switch here. The program takes a few seconds to load, and then it starts going forward until it hits something. Then it turns and takes off again. So that's kind of fun. Video 2, checking the kit contents. It is important to first make sure you have all the correct parts in your kit before getting started. The kit comes with a nice pictorial diagram that you can use to verify you have all the parts needed to construct the car. Install the CD software and start charging the batteries using the charger from the kit. When you are charging the batteries, the light on the charger will blink between red and green the entire time the batteries are charging. The light doesn't seem to change when the batteries are fully charged, so the amount of time in the charger is the only way to know when the batteries are fully charged. It is best to let the batteries charge overnight, but it's not necessary to do that to get enough charge to run the car. 1 or 2 hours on the charger gives plenty of charge to run the car for several minutes. Now pause the video and unpack the kit using this pictorial diagram to verify that you have all the parts needed. Okay, now that you've verified all the parts, go to the folder in the CD files titled Lesson 0, Assemble the Car, and open the PDF instruction manual. Gather the parts needed to fasten the motor mounting brackets on the motors. That is, you'll need the bag of motors, bag of motor mounting brackets, and bag of screws for motor, as you can see. Before we get started on that, let's take a look at how these motors on the assembled car are done. You can see this is the front of the car. The white end of the motor is pointing forward, and you can see how the bracket is mounted there, and then how the screws hold the motor to the bottom plate. So you can see that these brackets have screw holes in one end and not screw holes in the other end. So you want to make sure that you mount the screw holes in the correct orientation. So for the two motors in front, you'll have the screw holes pointing down when the motor, the white end of the motor is facing that way. Same thing for the motors in the back. So make sure you get those mounting brackets on correctly. And that basically is two motors, the mounting screw holes go one way, and two motors, the mounting screw holes go the other way. So let's do that. Let's do a little bit of a visual inspection here first. Now you can see sometimes these motors aren't assembled correctly. There is a little bit of a assembly problem back at the factory here when they do that, because you can see that there are wire ties that are supposed to hold the motor wires on to keep them stable and to keep them from breaking off the solder connection. Well, you see this motor is done correctly, except the wire tie is not tight. So let's tighten that up. We're going to tighten that by pulling this down. There. So now the motor wires are nice and tight, and that should help keep them from breaking off. Oh, and by the way, one more thing to note here. I had a student one time use a heat gun to put heat shrink around these connections. When he applied the heat from the heat gun, he melted this plastic bracket and broke the motor. So just be aware of that. Lesson learned. Okay, we're going to cut that excess off. And then for this one, I think it would be best long term if we replaced the wire tie. So we're going to cut this one off like this. Get a new one. Put the wires through it. And fasten the wires down. Okay, so now we feel better. Less chance of breaking a wire off. So go ahead and do that with all your motors and make sure they're nice and good shape. And I'm going to show you how to mount these guys. So if you take a look at your motors, you have one side where these screws are showing and there's a little dimple here. You want to mount your bracket on the opposite side, because the dimple kind of gets in the way sometimes. So you can see we have the screw holes up here. So we're going to put these screws through from the dimple side, and they just fit pretty snugly. So we're going to do that. Then for this motor, we're going to put the screw holes pointing up. Put these guys on. Okay, and then we're going to use a 7/64 hex wrench, which fits into the screw head, and a 7/32 nut driver or wrench on the nut, and just hand tighten it. It doesn't have to be super tight. You don't want to break the motor casing by reefing on it. But just make sure it's nice and tightly mounted. Okay, so there you have it. A motor ready to be mounted. So do this for the rest of the motors, and then we'll mount them to the chassis. Now we can see that we have all of our 4 motors. The strain relief on the wires on all 4 is in good shape, and we have 2 motors with the bracket holes pointing upward and 2 motors with the bracket holes pointing downward. Now we're going to mount them on the chassis. So let's get the chassis out here. You can see I have 2 pieces to the chassis. This piece with this rectangular hole here for the servo motor is the top piece. So we're going to set that aside for a minute. And this piece here with the holes for the line following sensors, this is the bottom piece, and so this is the piece that we're going to mount the motors on. One thing to note first is that these piece is covered with a little plastic protective coating, and so you want to take that off. And you can try to use your fingernails, but this knife works just super great. So I'd recommend using a knife and save your fingernails. So take that off. And we'll take this off. Okay, so there's no real polarity to this, so it doesn't matter which side you start with. But just remember the white ends of the motor stick out, so we are going to put this together. Now, of course, when you get your wheels, let me get a wheel out here. Your wheels are just going to push onto this little white shaft, right? So there's just going to push right on like that. So you want to make sure that that shaft is centered in this wheel well here. And so then we're going to take our mounting screws here, put them in there, and mount the motor. So loosely get one screw started, then the other screw, and then you want to take your time a little bit here and make sure that this is mounted kind of perpendicular as you can get it, and as flush as you can get it. So there's a little slop in there, so let's tighten it down a little bit and make sure that we have good perpendicular mounting and a good flush mount. And then you're going to want to hold the motor nice and tight when you tighten these, because sometimes tightening the screws themselves can cause the motor to move. So you don't want the motor to move. You want to hold it tight and tighten these babies down. This is a case where you do want to make sure it's nice and tight, because the motors will have a lot of stress on them, a lot of mechanical stress and motion, so you want these to be mounted nice and tight. Okay, so that's the way you want them to look. We have the wires coming off from the inside here, so go ahead and mount the other 3 motors. Alright, so now the motors are all mounted. We want to do a little inspection here first. So we take a look at it, we make sure that the shafts are perpendicular, looks pretty good. The motors are not loose, they're nice and tight. And the wires, none of the wires are pinned underneath the motors. They're all basically ready to be hooked up. Okay, so there we have the motors. Now we're going to assemble what they call the assembly of the driving board. The driving board is this H-bridge. So the driving board has an integrated circuit on here which has field effect transistors inside there, and you connect the motor pins to one side and the motor pins to the other side, and then you connect the control pins and power to the Arduino here. You have in 1, in 2, in 3, and 4, so you have two motors, and actually we're going to wire the motors on the vehicle in parallel, so two motors mounted to this, two motors mounted to that. And then when you put a signal on in 1, it will drive one of the motors in one direction. In 2, same motor, opposite direction. In 3, we'll do the same thing with the other motors. Okay, so now what they want us to do here is to take the bag of nuts and bolts for the L298N, and what we're going to do here, these screws are not long enough to go through this board and then through these holes all the way. We don't want to damage this board. It's got solder connections and leads protruding out the bottom here. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to mount these screws on here, mount these nuts on here, if we can do that. Okay, so we're just going to do that. We're going to tighten them down. Okay, where'd my hex wrench go? We're going to tighten them down. Not super tight. We don't want to crunch the printed wiring board. That could damage the circuits. But just hand tight, like that. So we're going to do that with all the screws, and then we're just going to sit it down in those holes, and it will be loose. But you can see there's really not much room for a nut on there. You could put nuts on there if you want to, but it's not necessary. It'll stay in its place. Okay. So put the rest of these screws on, and that will take care of this part. Okay, the screws are mounted, and then it drops right in there nicely. And I think if I have some nuts left over, I don't know, I might try to put them on there. Anyway, so there's that part of it. The next step is the assembly of the tracking module. So these are the infrared tracking modules. Take these out. And here is the packet of bolts and nuts for the line tracking. They did a very nice job of packaging these things up and giving you a few extras here and there. So now we have a new little device here. This is a standoff, and it basically has a screw on one end and threaded hole on the other. And what we are going to do we're going to take this with the potentiometer and the pins and the sensors on the top side. We're going to put this standoff in the bottom, and then we're going to put a screw on. I'm sorry, put a nut on. And again, this we don't want to tighten real hard because we don't want to crunch the circuit board and damage the circuitry. But we do want to make sure that it is tight, just hand tightened. Okay, so we do that with the next one, and then you do that for... Alright, so for all three line following sensors, we have the standoffs mounted. Now we're going to mount them to the bottom front of the car. So again, these motors and the H-bridge are on top. And we are going to mount these guys all three in a row, just like that. So pretty simple. By the way, if you want a nut driver for these, this is a 3/16. 3/16 nut driver works great for these little dudes. So we're going to take one of the nuts, if I can hold on to it here. We're going to take one of the screws, put it through there, and now we're going to screw it into the threaded portion of the standoff, just like this. And I screw it in, we'll leave it a little loose until we get the other one in, and then we'll tighten them both down. As you're tightening down these line sensors, you can see there's a lot of play because of the size of the screw holes. Just for comfort level, you don't want them to be all cockeyed, so make sure you try to get them as straight as possible when you tighten them down. Again, they're going to want to turn as you tighten them down, so hold them while you're doing that and see if you can get them as perpendicular as possible. Alright, there we go. That's about as straight as I could get them. Now you can see I've bent some of the pins here, so we want good spacing on these pins. Just bend them back, and then when we push the connectors on, the connectors will go on smoothly. Okay, now we are going to assemble the Arduino Uno onto the top plate. Also, make sure you got these sensors mounted on the correct side of the board, opposite from the motors. Okay, so our H-bridge fell out. Plug H-bridge back in here and set this off to the side. So here's the top plate, again with the big rectangular hole in it. And we're going to peel this stuff off. So here's your Arduino Uno board. It says Uno on it. And let's take it out of its static package here. And so we have the screws that we need here for Uno, ultrasonic, and cell box. So in this case, they want us to mount this board directly to this surface using the 3 holes provided. And you can see the 3 holes there. So it is important to get this board oriented correctly. And also it's going to be very important not to tighten these screws very tightly because we don't want to damage the board. So we're just going to put a screw in there, put the nut on, and again you can see we don't want to tighten this down too tightly or we'll break the board. So we're just going to turn these a little bit and make sure the nuts are not loose, and call it good. Okay. So now if you look at the instruction manual, verify that the board is oriented correctly with the rectangular hole here and the chip going in this direction. Then we're going to take the expansion board. This is the expansion board. It's also a blue circuit board. It's a pain to get out, so I recommend you just cut it out. This expansion board is awesome, and basically it plugs in to these pins here. See, so you want to line these up so you don't have all the pins, the same number of pins here that you have on the Uno board, right? So you're got a couple extra pins here. SCL and SDA, so your I squared C bus doesn't come up here, and you have a couple extra pins here. So you're just going to line those up, and then don't poke holes in your fingers, just snap it into place. Okay, so that's how the expansion board mounts. Okay, and okay, here we have the infrared receiver. This is for the remote control. And what they did here was they basically have you mount it on these 2 little tiny holes here. There aren't any standoffs or anything. And the only place I could find screws for that were in this package here. This is the package for the servo motor and the ultrasonic distance sensor. So what I did was I stole 2 screws out of this package. They're the long machine screws. So I took 2 of these long machine screws and used it for the IR distance sensor, which puts you short 2 long screws of these for your ultrasonic sensor, which is not a big deal. Just it still works just fine. I'll show you what I mean. So here's the infrared sensor, and you can see it's kind of a pain because it's right next to this switch. You're going to want to get some double-sided tape and maybe put the switch out here a little further away from it so it doesn't block the sensor, and with the screws in there it kind of makes it point down. But when you get to the end, you'll see that on my ultrasonic sensor I don't have any screws in the bottom holes, just 2 in the top holes, and so that's where I stole the screws from. No biggie. So go ahead and mount the infrared sensor as shown by putting these screws through these holes and then through those holes, and then put the nuts on, and again just hand tighten. You don't want these, you don't want to do any damage to that circuit board there. And good enough. Now we are going to mount the battery box. So we popped it out of its little bag here, and you can see we have red and green wire, red and black wires coming out of here, and the black wire is going through a switch, on-off switch, and then you have a plug which will plug into the Uno here and provide power to it, and then these wires will go down to the motor controller and power the motor controller. So the battery box mounts here on these two screw holes, and we're just going to use a couple of these to mount it with. Now, one thing with this battery box that you have to be knowledgeable about is that your batteries won't plug in if these screw heads are sticking up this high. So they'll interfere with putting your batteries in. So this is a time when we are going to use our muscles. We are not going to hand tighten, but we are going to nice and tightly tighten these screws so that they go down, pull them down inside of that plastic a little ways. You can see it's being pulled down into the plastic. So this does take a little bit of muscle here to get those things as far down as you can so that they don't interfere with the battery. So I think that's far enough down for that one. And then we want to do the same with this. Just pull them nice and as far down as you can get them in there so that the batteries will fit. Now, one thing to note about these batteries, these are lithium-ion batteries, and so if you damage them mechanically, if you squish them, scratch them, punch a hole in them, they can actually catch on fire, and it's a fire that's hard to put out. So you don't want that to happen. And the way you install these batteries is you push that down into the slot on the spring side, slide this down, and voila. So now the battery's in place. Now to get the battery out is sometimes a pain because these things are really in there, right? So the best way to do it is to use leverage to pop one end out and then take it out, right? And so we haven't damaged it to cause any problems, but that's how you put the batteries in and take them out. Okay, so the battery holder is now mounted, and we are going to plug into the Uno. You can see in the completed unit how those wires run real close to the wheel. So I've used a wire tie here to keep it from getting tangled in the wheel. So there's a little trouble lurking there if you're not careful. Okay, so now we have what they call the assembly of the ultrasonic wave pan tilt. So we have a couple of pieces of plexiglass mounting brackets here. Let's take the paper off from these. Alright, so there we go. So let's get our servo motor out. Now we have a servo motor. We also have this package of nuts and bolts for the SG90, which look a little bit longer than those, so let's not get them too mixed up here. Keep our nuts and bolts in their own little barnyard area. And we also have an ultrasonic sensor. So we're going to cut that loose out of its cage. Alright. So the way they show you in the manual here is to install this bracket on your servo motor. The one you want to use is this one here, but you don't want to tighten it down yet because we're going to mount something to it and it has to be aligned. So they say connect the permanent seat to the steering engine, which I call a servo motor, and then they want us to mount this to it. So don't worry about this. This is going to come off later. So for now we'll just put a screw in there and screw it down like this, and then we'll do the alignment later. So for now let's just do this. Okay, there we go. Okay, time to mount the ultrasonic distance sensor to the mounting bracket on the servo motor. And it mounts on this front side in these holes as shown. Now we're just going to use two of these, the two that we have left of these long small screws. I think they're 2mm screws. And we're going to put them through this ultrasonic distance sensor and through these holes and then tighten it down with a nut. However, we have a slight problem, and that's that these screws don't fit in these holes. So we are going to have to drill out those holes a little bit, not a lot, just enough to get the screws through. So what I have here is a micro drill bit set, and we're going to use this to put new holes in. So the way I like to do this is I like to use the micrometer to measure the size of the shaft. Go up just a tad, so 3/32 drill would probably be the best. and you don't have to look at a drill bit to see what the number is. All you have to do is find a drill that's close, a drill bit that's close, and these are close but no cigar. And so, I don't know, I think this one might do it. Yeah, this is just the right size. So you can see 5/64 is the exact same size as that screw. So let's try this one. Okay, so we're just going to take this. We're just going to simply drill this hole out a little bit larger. You don't want to use like a big, powerful mechanical drill here if you can avoid it, because as you can see, we don't have a lot of room to work with along these corners. We don't want to damage any of the circuits in there as well that might be near these holes. So we're just going to drill these top two holes, are the only two that we need to do this with. And then make sure the screw will go in there. And it does, just perfectly. And then we're going to push through here and put the nuts on. This one's giving me a little bit of trouble, but we can do it. And of course, again, don't use any muscles, just tighten these down hand tight. And you can kind of see the sensors are pointing up a little bit. Might not really want that. So I'll loosen this a little bit. Maybe it would be a good idea if we just did one of these bottom ones here. Let's put this down in the bottom one there so that we get it kind of not pointing upwards. Okay. So that's a little better. That looks like it's pointing a little better. So it's mounted well enough. All right. Now let's locate this little bracket here for the servo motor. And what we're going to do is we're going to mount the servo motor in this bracket so that we can mount it to the plate here. Right, so that's how it's going to go. When it's done, it's going to look just like this. Right? So we need to get that servo motor and its wires underneath here while this part is on top. So the way you do that, stick your wires through this hole, and then we are going to push the servo motor down in there. However, guess what? It looks like they made this bracket to exactly fit the servo motor, which makes it difficult to install. In fact, impossible. We don't want to use leverage. We don't want to break the bracket, but going in at this angle, there is not enough slack and bigness in this rectangular hole to fit the servo motor. So we're going to have to make a little adjustment here. We're going to have to file down and make more room inside this rectangular bracket so that the servo motor will fit. But you got to be careful so that you don't file too much off and go into these holes here, the screw holes for the servo motor. So we just need to make it big enough to fit the servo motor without damaging these holes. So I'm going to go ahead and file these down until the servo motor fits. Okay, you can see now I've filed these two edges near the holes, and I actually kind of filed into that one hole there, but I think it'll still be okay. And then I also filed this edge here because that rectangular hole is so tight that it interferes with this thin little label. So now, with any luck, we're going to pull this wire through. We're going to set this in there, and voila, the servo motor fits. Okay, with just a little bit of filing, that did the trick. So now we need to put a screw in the servo motor to hold it down. Ideally 2 screws, but as it turns out in the kit that I have, the screws like these number 2 short screws like this, aren't long enough to get a nut on the other side here. So what I did was I took one screw out of this infrared sensor here. You can see there's only one screw there now. And so now I have an extra long screw, and I'm going to mount that in the front here through here. And we'll use this here to mount the servo motor with one screw, and that'll be fine. It'll work just fine. So now that we have a nice long screw for the servo motor, we're going to mount the servo motor in the chassis hole, which fortunately is big enough for the motor to fit through. And then put the nut on here. Always fun working with these tiny little nuts and screws, but once you get the hang of it, it's not too hard. Okay, so now we have a good servo motor mount. We're going to put some of these screws here and mount this bracket down nice and tight. If we can. I don't think you need all 3 of them, so I'm just going to put 2 in. Tighten these down. The robot is starting to take shape. It's starting to look like a real little robot now. Okay, there we go. Looks like we're in pretty good shape with the servo motor. And now it's time to wire things up. Hallelujah.